Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be talking about Bone Curse Skeleton Necromancer. No uniques at all needed for this build this time around. And why is that? Well, recently, a friend and I were talking about the abysmal state of the current skeleton archetype in Necromancer and how you're required to use uniques to make them start scaling damage in an appropriate manner, like Lich's Scorn, of course, stuff like that. And I was like, there are some ways of making them work. And he was like, prove it to me. So, of course, we decided to have a little bit of a bet. And the terms were I needed to get a actual skeleton build to around 200 corruption while also only running skeletons and no uniques. Well, it turns out there are ways of doing it, and I found one of them. So let's talk about that today. So the idea is we're utilizing Bone Curse. The way Bone Curse works is we apply it to an enemy, right? So whenever we apply it to an enemy, if that enemy is hit by any hit, right, it will proc another hit that cannot apply ailments or anything like that. That will deal a portion of your damage as physical damage. So, like for instance, it right now it does 20% of my added physical or just added damage in general as physical damage. Now, it's tripled for my hits, but for 20% for everything else. Now, normally that doesn't really sound that much, but it turns out you can get a lot of hits in when you're playing a minion build. So, like right now, I have 14 different minions, and that means that 14 times 20%, that's about 280% of my damage applied as hits per second, or a little bit more than that because you take into account the attack and cast speed of the minions. Now, that on its own is not enough to make this work, of course. Now, we also grab a node inside Bone Curse that turns it into an aura. Now, the way that this works is whenever you walk over something, it is Bone Curse, meaning that you no longer have to actually self cast Bone Curse to make enemies get cursed. And this is not only a huge quality of life, it also means that you can grab the nodes behind it that gives Bone Curse even more significant damage. And all of that combined makes this build a very casual friendly build, very you know, AFK friendly build. You kind of just walk through monoliths, you have your skeletons kill stuff for you. You do have to cast Rip Blood here or there, and you have to cast Dreadshade here or there, but the button presses are at an all-time minimum for this kind of build, which I'm really happy with, considering that this build requires no uniques. You can level as this build, as I'll get into later, and you also, of course, require like little to no gear, to be honest, to get started. Now, there's a few things that makes this build pop, so let's talk about a few of them. The biggest thing is the ethics on exalted gear you can get on Acolyte. That is, of course, the increased spell damage per skeletal mage. This is very, very strong. So I have it on my helmet and my chest, and I'm getting well over 500% increased spell damage just for having minions. And I'm also running idols. It's giving me about 20 flat necrotic damage because I have minions. And this is really good as just having minions around actually buffing my spells, which of course your Bone Curse is your spell, so it's dealing your damage, so you need to build your own crit chance, own crit multi, stuff like that. Now there's also another node that we're abusing. We're also abusing Hollow Lich. So there's I think it's Rivers of Bones, I think the node is. It'll pop on screen. This node gives you a lot of critical damage, leeches life, and of course we can turn it into increased damage with Hollow Lich. So not only do we have like a 500% increased spell damage from everything else we also have 200% from Hollow Lich's interaction with River of Bones, and we also have a significant portion from all of our intelligence stacking, meaning that we don't need a single point of increased damage on our gear, meaning we can scale into crit multi, stuff like that. So that saves us a bunch of gearing, which means we can take those affixes and use minion health instead. Now, one of the biggest problems with, of course, using Hollow Lich is we lose all of our sustain, meaning what you need to do, of course, is you need to actually use Rip Blood to heal yourself. Thankfully, since we're stacking intelligence, we get a lot of healing effectiveness on Rip Blood, and it heals me for like half my HP every single time I hit something with it, which is great. Another reason why we're using Rip Blood is there's a node in it now that makes it so that you gain 8 spell flat damage per time you've hit an enemy with Rip Blood recently, and this allows us to scale our damage to the moon on single target. And of course, we're using the Dread Shade tech with the curse setup, where it gets more buff effect based on the enemy's life, meaning that we deal more and more damage as the enemy loses life, which all of this combined leads to a very fun build. I am going to go in game and we're going to talk about it a little bit more, and we're going to talk about how to level it. But if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of supporting me. Now, let's go in game, shall we? All right, here we are in game with Necromancer. So, the first thing I want to talk about is this is something that will kind of fool a lot of people currently. So right now, as you can tell, my minions are hitting the dummy, right? Now, when I turn on Bone Curse, as you can tell, well, those are all white numbers, Dread. You have like almost 100% crit chance with all of your gear and stuff like that. So why are they all white numbers? Well, that is because recently EHG, what they have done is they've made it so that numbers, whenever they're applied at the same time, so like for instance, Bone Curse and a minion hitting, right? That is applied at the same time, meaning that they are combined. Now, sadly, the hit that is applied first is the one that, you know, cares about whether or not the number will be white in a crit number, meaning that, of course, all your numbers are going to look really weird. But as you mess around with it, it's okay, because as you can tell in the background there, you can see the numbers going off, which is great. And this build has plenty of damage, which is wonderful. So let's talk about the skills, shall we? So for the retinue of Bonkers here, we're taking 3 points travel into Crippling Anguish, 1 point into Signet of Agony. Recently, they changed the VFX on this to look much better than it was before. I really like this VFX instead, and also as well the Bone Curse sticking out of you. It's really cool. Just so you know, Bone Curse is applying to yourself, so whenever you do get hit, you will get hit with Bone Curse. Now, from my testing overall, it hasn't really caused me too much problems. The only problem I could find when actually getting hit with Bone Curse is it seems like as though for some reason I am getting stunned significantly more than you should be with this kind of setup. It seems like as though Bone Curse is actually stunning me, which should not be the case because Bone Curse cannot apply ailments, i.e., stun. Stun is an ailment. So it should not be applying stun to me. So a little bit weird there, but whatever. Just a little bit of an interesting thing there. Pours 3 points into Swift Release. This reduces the Bone Curse duration, but gives you a lot of more damage, which is great. So, of course, we're going to be using this. This does mean that we need to be, like, the enemies need to be within our Bone Curse AoE for them to die. We're going to grab a bunch of increased area so that the area of our Bone Curse is bigger, so we, like, clear more stuff, which is great because, like I said, we need to walk over the enemies and apply Bone Curse to them and have our skeletons hit them to apply Bone Curse, which is great. Of course, more damage here, more damage here. This kill threshold's great. And this node, this explosion chance, it's really strong. It will like proc Bone Curse off of itself as well if you're within the area and all that, meaning that it will chain essentially and kill entire packs of spiders and stuff very quickly. Normally, necromancers don't have good clear, but this essentially gives you as much clear as you could possibly want. So overall, this node's really strong. I really like this node. Now, let's talk about the minions we have. We have skeletal archers and we have skeletal mages. Now, the problem here is I've tried melee minions like multiple times, right? We've played with melee minions, and I'm going to be honest, they're very squishy right now for absolutely no reason. I have all this minion life, minion regen, everything, like everything you can think of, and the minions, like the melee minions, still die. Thankfully, the best way of making minions not die is making sure they're ranged and, of course, aggroing the enemy so that, of course, they don't die. So right now, ranged minions will always be better than melee minions, not even because of damage, but because of survivability, at least on Necromancer. On Primos, it's a little bit different because their minions are allowed to have defenses for some reason. It's weird. So let's just talk about skeletons. Mainly, we just want as many plus skeletons as possible here. And we also want to remove warriors. And then, of course, grab the multi-shot so that my minions hit in a bigger area, as you can tell, like I'll show you here. Yeah, those projectiles here, they'll hit in a bigger area so that we can kill more stuff with Bone Curse, which is really strong. Now, for Skeletal Mage, the main things we care about is, of course, grabbing Grave Passage and Death Cavalry and all this so that we can move our minions with us. Sadly, right now, for some reason, this seems to be bugged with the affix on boots that uh, moves minions with us on traversal scale. So currently, we can only get 9 minions teleported with us, but eventually, if we were to get a pair of boots with the research affix that makes minions follow us, we could have our entire cadre come with us every single time we teleport, which would be absolutely wonderful. Hopefully, they fix this one sometime soon, right? And of course, extra skeletal mages, the extra projectile chance for more clear, the multiplicative attack and cast speed, the frenzy chance, of course, and that's pretty much it for skeletal mage. Then for Dreadshade here, the main things we care about is getting the more damage here, making it so that we are affected by it. So when we put it on an enemy, it affects us, and of course attached to an enemy so that it also applies. So for instance, like if the enemy is like a boss or whatever, and we apply Dreadshade to it and it's missing health, it'll also apply a buff effect to our Dreadshade, which is really good. Of course, Vitality. This gives us an actually decent chunk of armor, which is great for tanking bosses, and of course some flat damage here. And that's pretty much it for Dreadshade. And then of course Rip Blood, stereotypical Rip Blood setup. We just care about stench of blood, as much cast speed as possible, grabbing the health gained, and of course the health per intelligence. Let's make sure that Rip Blood keeps us sustained. This is our main sustain source, so make sure to use it liberally in monoliths. Getting some mana costs. We have exactly the amount of mana that Bone Curse technically uses right now. So this is all of our mana sustain as well. So not only is it giving us a bunch of damage thanks to arcane absorption, it's also healing us, and it's also giving us a bunch of mana, and it's also making our minions attack things that we want them to attack. So overall, it's a really good situation for us to be using Rip Blood. So we definitely want to be using Rip Blood. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about passives. So for passives here, the main notable one is getting this minion armor so that they get a little bit of armor for extra defense. Getting this minion health regen is really strong as it multiplies with all of our flat minion health regen, which is of course really strong. Getting as much minion attack and cast speed as possible is great because that the more attack and cast speed minions have, the more damage we do. Because we're not attacking, they're attacking, right? Which is great. And Lich here, mainly Hollow Lich here, turns all of our Leech here into increased damage, which gives us the edge that we need to keep, competitive with litter builds. Then the intelligence here for the flat minion life, and of course the healing on Rip Blood. Eventually, we want to be filling this out for the minion health regen as well, so that our minions have even more health regen, the intelligence and mana regen. Mainly, we want to be getting to 15 mana for the degen on Bone Curse, which is great. And then, of course, for Necromancer here, the things we care about, making sure we get this armor shed chance, as this is a very large portion of our more damage. It's like 60% more damage or something like that because of how many stacks we get. Getting the minion life here eventually is great. The extra skeletons, we want as many skeletons as possible so that they can, of course, proc our Bone Curse for us. Then minion res eventually. Rivers of Blood is such a ridiculous passive for us, gives us a bunch of crit and it gives us a bunch of increased damage. Also, as well, frantic summons for the attack and cast speed as well, and that applies to us as well, meaning that that's more Rip Bloods, and more Rip Bloods means more flat damage. So, as much attack speed as possible for us and our minions, it's just multiplicative damage, which is great. And that's pretty much it for passives. Now, let's talk about blessings. So, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't really get all of my blessings done. So, we're going to talk about the good kind of blessings. So, for here, crit multi, of course, getting as much crit multi as possible to deal as much damage as possible. Enemies can't kill you if they're dead, right? Now, of course, ending the storm here. So this is very interesting. It turns out since whenever Bone Curse hits you, of course, when an enemy hits you and then procs Bone Curse, it counts as an additional hit for sources of chance to gain ward when hit. So this means that this, on top of idols with chance to gain ward on hit, are really strong, as it, of course, reduces the amount of damage that we're taking, and it turns our Bone Curse from a negative on us into a positive. And eventually, if you have enough, idols and stuff laying around, you can eventually fill it out with a bunch of these idols and this blessing and be really tanky. Eventually, you'd want Crit Avoid or Minion All Res. Right now, the Reign of Dragons boss is really buggy. He can be pushed around constantly for absolutely no reason by minions, making him a pain in the ass to kill. So, cautionary tale on this one specifically. Spirits of Fire, we'd want the flat armor, of course, and then Age of Winter, we'd eventually want the percentage armor, and that's it for blessings. Now let's talk about gearing. Like I said, no uniques whatsoever. Idols. The main idols we have are just the necrotic spell damage idols, and of course, like I said, the chance to gain ward when hit idols eventually, and then resistance idols wherever else. Make sure you grab one minion chance to apply mark for death on hit. That's negative 25% resistances, which is really strong and like multiplicative damage for us. So make sure to grab one of these eventually. Now, for the helmet here, of course, we want the increased spell damage per skeletal mage, the minion life regen, then HP. Probably on a better base, to be honest. This is just what I've been using. Like I said, that increased spell damage is really strong. Amulet here, crit multi, Fizz Pen is really good too, life, stuff like that. I got really lucky with this amulet. I'm pretty happy with it. Scepter here, as you can tell, my scepter is garbage, but you'd eventually want something like this. You don't really care about the suffixes because Bone Curse cannot apply ailments with its hits, so we'd only be able to hit with like our Rip Blood and apply ailments with that. So maybe like Chill Chance, stuff like that. Armor here, increased spell damage per skeletal mage. Intelligence, because that increases not only our minion's base life, it also increases the amount of HP healing we get. Health, of course. This base is really strong as it gives our minions all res, which is a very hard stat to come by. So we definitely want that. Catalyst here, we want a Crystal Skull for the base crit chance, crit multi, wonderful. Res on the suffixes, good. We want minion health on the prefixes for our rings, health. We probably want movement speed rings eventually. Same thing with this one. Crit avoid, mana regen, minion health. This is just to make up for the fact that I don't have the crit avoid blessing from Reign of Dragons. Gloves here, minion health, HP. Eventually, you'd want like you can actually get melee damage leeches life on the prefix, and that would apply with Hollow Lich, so I can get to like I think like 70% increased damage from your gloves because of that, which is great. Crit chance, of course, would be great. Boots here, movement speed, crit avoid, HP, intelligence, the usual schlock, usually what you want. Here, minion health regen, HP, mana regen, of course. Catalyst here, minion health regen, of course. You want minion health regen everywhere to make sure that your skeletons aren't dying because you can't do any damage if all your minions are dead, so you have to make sure that they're alive. Of course, the crit, you can get plus the levels to Bone Curse, HP, everything's great on this. Now, I do want to talk about real quick uniques that we can use that would heavily benefit the build. So the first one that would benefit, of course, is Hollow Fingers. Having extra minions would increase our clear. Eventually, what you'd want to make sure is to get ones with LP. They have really low LP level, so getting like three LP ones would be great. Getting these and slotting them in would be great. Other uniques that we could use, any uniques that give us a large amount of stats for free so that we could reduce the amount of affixes that we're using. So, like the normal stuff, right? Trying to think like anything off the top of my head. Death Rattle wouldn't work because it's not their crit. Eventually, a Ribbons of Blood with LP would be great instead of like one of those hollow fingers. Like just stuff like that. You could run a vessel setup for the health regen. You could run a bone clamor setup instead of HP and get a bunch of ward, and then turn your Rip Blood into a ward source instead, which that would work as well. So like there's a lot of different ways to actually scale this build into the end game. Eventually you can get a better catalyst, like I said. You could run, of course, a Lich's Scorn and run Infernal Shades and try to get a bunch of damage there. There's a lot of different ways of building this character. Now, of course, let's talk about leveling. So I said that you could level this build. That is correct. So what you do is you take some skeleton early on. Make sure you only have one. Make sure you remove all the warriors first, like bum rush this, and then bum rush as many skeletons as possible. That combined with Rip Blood, with Arcane Absorption, and of course Bone Curse. Eventually, what you do is grab the more damage, then you self cast it and the explosion as well. Then you grab Signet of Agony, and as you know, you can clear Monoliths very easily with this combo. And eventually you shove in Skeletal Mages and then Dreadshade, and you can literally level as this build from like level 1 or 2 or whatever. So that's absolutely wonderful. I'm really happy that you can do that. There'll probably be eventually a full leveling guide on this kind of build eventually in the future. Now, with all that being said, this has been Dread off to go collect my bet winnings. Bye.